Thank you, Anna, for your very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at my second Oxford Farming Conference. And can I welcome the innovation shown in the creation of your app and also the live and interactive poll. When I saw that you were inviting people to say whether they felt buoyant, mostly confident, apprehensive, or inclined to cry help, I wondered if it was possible to vote for all four at once. Because at any given time in any given day in politics, I do move from being apprehensive to crying help, to feeling mostly confident, and then at 7 o'clock when I can open a bottle of wine, at last I feel buoyant. The other thing that I want to thank Anna for is her generous introduction. She was kind enough to say that she felt that I had been a breath of fresh air last year. But then, as she developed her meteorological metaphor, it became clear that she felt that perhaps over the last 12 months I had been closer to a mighty eruption of wind. And I'm sure that the truth lies somewhere in between. But I'm very grateful to Anna for introducing me, because I wanted to begin by reflecting on one of my favorite Radio 4 programs, second only to Farming Today, which is The Long View. It's presented by the superbly talented Guardian columnist Jonathan Freedland. And The Long View asks us all to consider current events in their historical context, and it draws parallels between the controversies of our time and the challenges of the past. Now, few professions, of course, take a longer view than agriculture. Farmers plan, invest, and produce for the long term. While those of us who are in Westminster live in a world of hourly Twitter storms and daily news cycles, where a week is now a very long time in politics, farming requires the patience and foresight to think in harvests and life cycles, to see beyond the immediate, and to scan the far horizon. Now, of course, the immediate political question which all of us must wrestle with is Brexit, and more particularly, how Britain leaves the European Union in less than 3 months' time. And I'll address that question head-on in a moment. But first, I do want to take a deliberately longer view. Because hugely significant as the changes generated by Brexit will be, it's important that we consider them in the broader context of the wider forces driving change in farming, food policy, and our relationship with the rest of the natural world. Because the truth is, as this conference is designed to underline, our world is entering a fourth agricultural revolution. The first revolution was the move from hunting and gathering to settlement and cultivation, which made possible the generation of surpluses, the beginning of trade, and the establishment of civilization. The second agricultural revolution was pioneered here in Britain from the 17th through to the 19th centuries. British farmers and landowners developed more sophisticated crop rotation and new mixed farming methods, which more efficiently turned pasture into protein and waste into fertilizer. Alongside the development of new seed drills, selective breeding, large-scale drainage schemes, and land reclamation, all these changes dramatically increased food production. That helped drive an equally dramatic increase in population numbers, which in turn sustained the Industrial Revolution. The third agricultural revolution was even more significant in its scale. In the middle decades of the last century, pioneering work by visionary scientists such as Norman Borlaug, whose granddaughter is with us here today, transformed the scale of food production worldwide. New seed varieties were generated that powerfully improved yields, and alongside improvements in fertilizer manufacture, pest control, and other forms of crop protection, they allowed developing nations to overcome scarcity and hunger, laying the groundwork for the global economic growth which has lifted billions out of poverty. Now, we're on the verge of another revolution in how we produce our food. And that's why I particularly welcome what your chairman, Tom Allen Stevens, called earlier the brazenly positive tone of this conference. We stand on the threshold of new horizons, Tom argued. Never before has our industry been offered the world of opportunity that presents itself here before us today. And he's right. Accelerating technological advances, as he mentioned, such as the drive towards artificial intelligence, the more sophisticated than ever analysis of big data, drone development, machine learning, and robotics will together allow us to dramatically improve productivity on traditionally farmed land, not least by reducing the need for labor, minimizing the imprint of vehicles on the soil, applying inputs overall more precisely, adjusting cultivation techniques more sensitively, and therefore using far fewer natural resources, whether carbon, nitrogen, or water, in order to maximize growth. Data analytics, allied to the sensors which monitor the health of livestock, will also allow us to develop the optimal environment for animals, helping us to get their nutrition right, safeguard their welfare, and improve both dairy and meat production. Gene editing holds out the promise of dramatically accelerating the gains that we've secured through selective breeding in the past. The ability to give Mother Nature a helping hand by driving the process of evolution at higher speed should allow us to develop plant varieties and crops which are more resistant to disease and pests and less reliant on chemical protection and chemical fertilizer. They will be high yielding and more environmentally sustainable. Vertical farming, with vegetables grown in temperature, moisture, and nutrition-controlled indoor environments, can also guarantee improvements in yield while at the same time limiting environmental externalities. And of course, vertical farms not only minimize land use, but they can of course be located close to the urban population centers that they serve. And we are also likely to see more and more of our need for protein met by aquaculture and cellular agriculture. Fish farming is an increasingly efficient way of using crops to generate nutritious proteins, and advances in synthetic biology may allow us to create traditional animal products, from gelatine and egg whites to milk and even meat, in labs. The potential for Britain to lead in this revolution is huge, which is why Tom Allen Stevens is right that we should look to the future with confidence. Now, of course, there are challenges. To take advantage of precision technology, AI, robotics, and data analytics requires a level of capital investment which is not available to all. There are also important ethical and economic questions about gene editing, which we need to debate. Vertical farming relies on energy inputs, which are currently costly and carbon intensive. Fish farming, of course, generates its own environmental externalities. And lab-grown proteins, meanwhile, are very far from everyone's idea of a mouth-watering treat, and they're currently extremely expensive. But while there are big questions we need to debate about how we handle these new technologies, and we're better to debate them than at the Oxford Farming Conference, we cannot wish away these changes any more than we can ignore having to deal with the impact of climate change, air pollution, soil depletion, global population growth, the stress placed on water resources, the tide of plastic in our oceans, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. Because the background against which this fourth agricultural revolution is occurring, indeed many of the stimuli for it, are the environmental and social factors that I've just briefly listed. The requirement to use less carbon, to limit the nitrous oxide entering our atmosphere and the nitrates entering our rivers, to improve the organic content and fertility of our soil, to renew, to reuse, and to recycle finite natural resources, and yet at the same time also to improve resource productivity as the human population grows. All these are the forces driving technological innovation. Science is thus both making us aware of why agriculture needs to change and also enabling that change to meet our needs. This fourth agricultural revolution will therefore require us to change the way that we work on the land and invest in its future. It will force us to reform the role of government in regulating and supporting farming. It will demand new thinking and new talent in food production. And it will inevitably require tough choices to be made. For some, the adjustment will undoubtedly be challenging. But no change is not an option. Reform is vital to modernize the sector and to capitalize on technological advances. In 2016-17, more than half of the UK's farms earned less than £20,000, and a fifth made no profit at all. As John Varley of Clinton Devon Estates observes, these statistics would make most investors that are not looking for tax breaks steer well clear. If, however, we embrace the potential of the fourth agricultural revolution, we can guarantee the future of the United Kingdom as a major global food producer. We can play our part in alleviating poverty and scarcity. We can replenish our store of natural capital. We can secure investment for the innovations in tackling waste, pollution, and emissions which the world will increasingly need. And we can hand on both a healthier economy and an enriched environment to the next generation. So, as the German statesman Otto von Bismarck once put it, if revolution there is to be, far better to undertake it than undergo it. So today I hope to outline how DEFRA sees its role in the midst of this fourth revolution, with respect to all the areas for which the department is responsible: food, the rural economy, and our environment. Food first. Food production has been a success story for Britain. Food and drink is our biggest manufacturing sector, with our food and drink contributing £113 billion to the economy every year. And the consumer has benefited from the enterprise and innovation of our food producers. British citizens have a wider choice of high-quality food than ever before, and the cost of food for the consumer has fallen significantly in recent decades. And we have safe, nutritious, affordable food in abundance in this country because of our farmers, their hard work, enterprise, and commitment. But we cannot take this bounty for granted, and nor can we ignore the looming problems that we face. In a world facing the pressures that I listed earlier, how do we provide food security for this country? Do the economics of contemporary food production add up? How do we help those in this country and across the globe who are living in poverty? And since diet is central to health, does our approach to food currently maximize human well-being? And critically, what do we think is required to make food production in this country truly sustainable? The fourth agricultural revolution would require us to rethink the future of food in any case. But if coming scientific and technical innovations are to be harnessed wisely and in harmony with human flourishing, then we need, as a country, to have a much wider and more informed debate about food. That's why I've asked DEFRA's lead non-executive director, the food entrepreneur Henry Dimbleby, to lead on the development of a new food strategy. He'll be visiting farms and food producers and working with people across the industry to ensure that we ask the right questions. On food security, for example, I think it's critical that we conceptualize the challenge properly. Our food security currently rests on both healthy domestic food production and, of course, global trading links. But healthy domestic production in the future is likely to require not just investment in new technology, but also our improving the resilience of the environment on which we depend for future growth. So food security in the future should mean, for example, returning soils to robust health and improving their organic content. It should also mean keeping pollinator numbers healthy and improving animal welfare and husbandry to minimize health problems and disease risk. It will probably also require us to build in resilience and flexibility to our agricultural sector so that we can deal with changes that we cannot anticipate by ensuring that we have diversity in both the size and the type of farm business in this country. And food security will also mean guarding against those looming changes that we can foresee, taking steps to minimize flood risk, to adapt to climate change, and to safeguard biodiversity, so we have a rich bank of natural capital on which to draw for the future. And food security necessarily also involves providing consumers not just with a plentiful and resilient supply of food, but with guarantees on provenance and welfare, which is why the new Livestock Information Programme, which Minette Batters has championed and helped to secure this year, is so important. It will enable us to reassure domestic consumers on the safety of our produce, as well as securing a competitive edge in a world market where quality is increasingly key. Now, of course, with respect to future trade, we know that there will always be food and materials required for food production, which we will have to source from abroad. But we also know that climate change is going to have an impact on the resilience and range of food production in other countries, particularly in the global south. So countries like our own will have to play an even more important role in world food production. And if we are to maintain our own resilience and reputation for quality, that means that we must maintain our own high environmental and animal welfare standards. And we must not barter them away in pursuit of a necessarily short-term trade-off. And that takes me to another one of the key questions about the economics of food production. Affordable food for every citizen is a key goal of public policy. But we should be clear about the real costs of food production. Beef or soybeans produced to scale on land in other countries that have been cleared of vast hectares of forests, may appear cheap, but in fact, such food is costing the earth. The loss of forest cover imposes environmental costs on all of us, as valuable carbon sinks disappear and a defense against climate change is dismantled. The argument that we can lower the cost of food by importing from countries that have pursued deforestation policies ignores the fact that we all have to pay for the environmental damage in other ways. And there are, of course, other key economic questions that the food strategy must address. While consumers have enjoyed the benefits of increased efficiency in British farming, why have so many farmers not reaped anything like the same benefits? Compared with a generation ago, it's often the case that farmers receive a lower share of the money that we, the public, hand over to supermarkets and to other food retailers. Now, that's in part because of post-Farmgate innovation. Supermarkets are offering consumers added value, scrubbed potatoes, chicken seasoned and sold in roasting bags, which customers are happy to pay more for. But that innovation has inevitably reduced the percentage of the final price which has gone to the farmer. So, as farmers become even more efficient and they get an even better return per hectare, how can we ensure that we have a profitable farm sector alongside low prices for good food? Well, part of the answer is greater transparency. The more information we have, and especially the more information an increasingly discerning public have when they make consumer choices, the better that markets work. And if markets aren't working, because some players are operating unfairly or anti-competitively, then government should intervene. And intervention is also required when it comes to health. The growth in obesity, the acceleration in numbers of patients with type 2 diabetes, the spiraling in cases of diet-related heart disease and cancers, all require us to look at the impact of what we eat on how we live and die. This challenge, however, requires very careful handling. A crude attempt to label certain foods, meat, dairy, as somehow inherently unhealthy does not do justice to the scale and complexity of the problem. Neither does crude calorie labeling. A proper food strategy must look more widely at the socioeconomic factors and trends relating to diet and health problems, such as obesity, diabetes, and other diet-related illnesses. And the fact that these problems disproportionately affect more disadvantaged sectors of society should offend our sense of social justice. That's why we need to ask searching questions about just where, how, and why poor diet occurs. I want our food strategy, therefore, to be ambitious, to ask big questions, and to challenge lazy orthodoxies, to place food security on a sounder footing, to enable food producers to plan for the future with confidence, to provide a proper understanding of the real economics of the food industry, to harness the potential of new technology to improve productivity, to make that productivity growth genuinely sustainable, and to improve the nation's health. I see our food strategy as another opportunity for Britain to show a lead in this world of opportunity. Now, of course, there is already one conspicuous way in which we do lead the world when it comes to food. Our universities are home to some of the most respected agriculture, food, and environmental science, vet medicine, land management, chemistry, zoology, and botany departments in the world. A new generation of farmers, scientists, bio and agri-tech entrepreneurs are already reinforcing Britain's reputation as a centre of excellence and innovation. But I want us to go further. There is a huge opportunity for British talent to shape the fourth agricultural revolution. But we need to ensure that we attract even more talented people into the food and farming industry. I've been hugely encouraged in that regard by the work of colleagues such as Don Curry, Fiona Kendrick, Peter Kendall, and Minette Batters, who've been collaborating to think creatively about the skills and talent that we'll need in the future to maintain leadership in the food production sector. And we will be saying more about what government can do to help when recommendations come forward through the Food and Drink Sector Council. But I've already been discussing with the Business Secretary Greg Clark and the new Higher Education and Science Minister Chris Skidmore the need for us all collectively to show even greater ambition. Now, of course, food is at the heart of every farming business, and farming is the backbone of the rural economy. Our ambition at DEFRA to lead the world in our thinking about food depends on our ability, in the first place, to maintain a healthy farming sector and overall a robust rural economy. And that in turn requires us to think about the role of government in supporting all those who live and work in the countryside. Now, we have already pledged to spend the same level on farm support in cash terms after we leave the European Union right up until the end of this Parliament. That is, and it's often forgotten, a greater degree of security over future funding for farming than that enjoyed by any other existing EU nation. I recognise, however, that farming, because it is a quintessentially long-term business, benefits from as much certainty as possible about the future. And with the scale of change coming that I mentioned earlier, the more assurance that we can provide, the better. Now, I cannot here entirely preempt the outcome of the government's spending review, but both the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury are committed to using that review to support growth, to encourage technological innovation, and to demonstrate British leadership in areas of business excellence, as well as spreading prosperity more equitably across the country. So, if we embrace the changes that I've been discussing today, we will ensure that British agriculture and the rural economy more widely will be able to benefit in that spending review. Embracing change, supporting reform, is the key to unlocking the Treasury's special box. But while I cannot preempt the outcome of the spending review, I can continue to demonstrate the case for and to put in place the policies that will underpin long-term investment. That's why we've secured a 7-year agricultural transition beyond the 21-month transition period set out in the EU withdrawal agreement to enable farm businesses to plan ahead. And that's also why we've published proposals to allow for agricultural support payments to be rolled forward into a lump sum, which can be used now to remodel farm businesses for the future. And it's also why we've commissioned a review by Lord Bew of Donegal to look at what factors should be taken into account to ensure an equitable intra-UK allocation of domestic farm support funding. And again, in advance of the spending review, the government has also made a commitment to invest in the extension and improvement of rural broadband coverage. In the budget, the government announced that it would invest a further £200 million over the next 2 years, providing full fibre broadband in rural areas. This is in line with the outside-in approach set out in last year's Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, which committed to connecting remote rural areas so the UK has a truly nationwide state-of-the-art broadband network at last. Because we all know that the potential of the fourth agricultural revolution will only be fully realised if we ensure the very best levels of digital connectivity across rural Britain. And that is why this investment has been prioritised. Now, all of these investments sit alongside our other commitments to invest in rural communities. In our agriculture bill, we make provision for payments to improve productivity specifically, to support collaboration and to help rural businesses cope with change. And it's critically important that we support efforts to bring farmers together, to support innovation and collaboration, because that will help ensure that we keep a wide range of different farm businesses resilient in the face of change, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of food security. And it's particularly important that we're sensitive to the need of smaller farmers, because I'm acutely aware that for many of them, the changes in how we provide support and the changes in how technology will affect production raise real challenges. In many parts of the country, it is smaller farmers who preserve, in the words of the Prince of Wales, the culture in agriculture. From the Lake District to Exmoor, from East Sussex to Teesdale, there is, alongside our natural environment, a delicate human ecology that we need to consider, which we also need to conserve and enhance. And in reflecting on the challenges faced by smaller farmers, especially livestock farmers, it is important to be straight about the really significant challenge which would be posed by a no-deal Brexit. Now, as I suspect some of you know, I argued for Britain to leave the European Union, and I believe strongly that our departure allows us to rejuvenate our democracy, to make power more accountable, to escape from the bureaucratic straitjacket of the CAP, and to develop a more vibrant farming sector with access to technologies that the EU is turning its back on. Leaving the EU also means that we can end support for inefficient area-based payments, which, as we know, reward the already wealthy and hold back innovation. And we can move to support genuine productivity enhancement and also support public goods like clean air or climate change mitigation, or the improvement of soil health, or the improvement of water quality, or the improvement of pollinator habitats. We can also better support organic farming, landscape restoration, and biodiversity enrichment, as well as improving public access to the countryside. All of these are real gains, which our departure from the EU can bring. But these real gains risk being undermined if we leave the European Union without a deal. Of course, a nation as adaptable, resilient, and creative as ours can and will flourish over time, even without a deal. But the turbulence which would be generated by our departure without a deal would be considerable. As I said earlier, it would hit worst those who are our smaller farmers and our smaller food businesses. Now, I know that some of the predictions about what might happen without a deal have been dismissed as another episode of Project Fear, a rerun of the lurid claims in the 2016 referendum that a vote to leave would trigger an automatic recession. At the time, I vigorously rejected those projections, and indeed was criticized by some for being too dismissive of expert opinion. Well, no recession came, and the economic forecasts turned out to be unfounded. But while Project Fear proved to be fiction, when we look at what a no-deal Brexit could involve, we do need to be clear about the costs and the facts. A no-deal Brexit means that we could face overall tariff rates of around 11% on agricultural products. But as I mentioned earlier, some sectors would be much more severely affected. According to the AHDB's Excellent Horizon report, we export around 15% of our beef production and around a third of our lamb. And in both cases, about 90% of that export trade goes to the EU. Some of that trade is routed through Rotterdam to other markets beyond the EU, but most of it goes to European consumers. And it's a grim but inescapable fact that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, the effective tariffs on beef and sheep meat would be above 40%, in some cases well above that. And while exchange rates might take some of the strain, the costs imposed by new tariffs would undoubtedly exceed any adjustment in the currency markets. And of course, if the pound does make exports more competitive, it also feeds inflationary pressures at home. And tariffs are not the only issue. While the EU have pledged to accelerate the process whereby the UK is recognized as a third country, and we can therefore continue to export food to their markets freely, all products of animal origin will have to go through border inspection posts. And at the moment, the EU have said that 100% of products will face sanitary and phytosanitary checks. Much of our trade currently reaches European markets through the narrow straits between Dover and Calais. At the moment, there are no border inspection posts at Calais. And while we do hope that the French take steps to build capacity there, that capacity is unlikely by the end of March, to be generous. The EU have also said that hauliers from the UK can carry export goods to EU markets, but they cannot make multiple journeys from EU country to EU country unless the costs of haulage could rise as well. The combination of significant tariffs when none exist now, friction and checks at the border when none exist now, and requirements to reroute or pay more for transport when current arrangements are frictionless will all add to costs for producers, as will new labouring requirements, potential delays in the recognition of organic products, potentially reduced labour flows, and the need to provide export health certificates for the EU market, which are not needed now. Of course, we can and are at DEFRA doing everything to mitigate those costs, and we're developing plans to help support the industry in a variety of contingencies. But nobody can be blithe or blasé about the real impact on food producers in this country of leaving without a deal. That is just one of the reasons why I hope my colleagues in Parliament support the Prime Minister's deal. It isn't perfect, but we should never make the perfect the enemy of the good. It not only gives us a 20-month transition period in which current access is completely unaffected, It also allows us to maintain continuous tariff and quota-free access to EU markets for our exporters after that. And it also allows us to diverge from EU regulation in many areas after the transition. And of course, it also means that we will leave the common agricultural policy, and it ends all mandatory payments to the EU. If Parliament doesn't back the Prime Minister's deal, all of those gains will be put at risk. However, if we do secure support for the deal, then we can begin to forge ahead with further reforms which can put Britain in a truly world-leading position, not just in food production, but also in the wise stewardship of our natural assets. I've talked about food, I've talked about our economy, and I now turn to the environment. Because outside the European Union and the Common Agricultural Policy, we can at last reward farmers for the environmental goods that they generate, which are not rewarded in the market. Our proposed environmental land management contracts will provide farmers and other land managers with a pipeline of income, a new pipeline of income to supplement the money that they make from food production, forestry, and other business activities. ELMs should be seen as an additional crop, with the government, rather than a commercial player, entering into a contract with farmers to ensure that we increase the provision together of environmental services. And of course, many of these will also play a part in enhancing overall farm productivity. ELM payments are designed not just to complement existing sources of income, but also to complement existing initiatives that many farmers are already pursuing. For example, the adoption of minimum tillage techniques can not only decrease costs and therefore improve productivity overall, but they also reduce runoff and erosion. Well, that's a public good, which contributes to improving water quality, and for which farmers should be properly paid. Similarly, farmers who've chosen to go organic can secure a premium in the market for their produce. But their contribution to improving the level of organic matter in our soil also leads to more carbon sequestration and to broader environmental resilience. These are public goods, which too should be rewarded. Upland livestock farmers, including commoners of course, are responsible for maintaining some of our most iconic landscapes in a condition which not just sustains farm businesses, but also acts as a habitat for precious native species. Improved habitats with more diverse wildlife, which are also likely to attract tourist income to less favoured areas, are also public goods that we should recognise. And equally, farmers should be rewarded for enhancing the natural capital of which they're stewards, for protecting ancient woodland, bringing woodland under active management, or restoring peat bogs. These all generate public goods by adding to our carbon storage, boosting air quality, tackling global warming, and of course also improving water quality. And because we recognise that farming is a long-term business, we believe that these public goods should be paid for through multi-annual contracts. Now, of course, I recognise there'll be wariness about, among some, considering how these contracts are delivered because of the woeful way in which environmental and countryside stewardship payments have been delivered recently. I absolutely understand that concern. But recent changes at both Natural England and the Rural Payments Agency are beginning to address the problems that we face and which we've inherited. And we are now relentlessly focused on how to streamline the bureaucracy that we've inherited under the CAP to ensure that farmers can concentrate on their core business of sustainable food production and enhancement of our natural capital. And that's why I commissioned Dame Glenys Stacey to look at the whole landscape of farm regulation and inspection. Her report, which is a brilliant analysis of how to make inspection more proportionate, focused, and effective, makes clear that outside the EU and the CAP, we can have less onerous inspection, simpler regulation, and also greater confidence in the maintenance of high standards. Just as I believe that we can be world leaders in food production and environmental enhancement, so I believe that we can, building on Dame Glenys's work, set the global gold standard in trusted, transparent, and efficient regulation of farming. There is a world of opportunity for British agriculture if we are all collectively prepared to embrace the opportunities that our policy reforms and indeed the wider technological revolution can bring. With an ambitious new food strategy, a properly funded 25-year environment plan, rising investment in agri-tech, world-leading centres of agricultural science, a new generation of entrepreneurs in the food industry, an innovative new system of support for the provision of environmental services, and above all, farmers across the country committed to demonstrating leadership in everything they do, I believe that this country, just as it led the great agricultural revolution of the 18th century, can be the vanguard nation for this century's new agricultural revolution. And I look forward to the participants in this Oxford Farming Conference leading the way. Thank you.